caramba, my friends, let's head south of the border now to pick up the other major regional trade bloc in the Western Hemisphere, and that would be MERCOSUR. When I said head south of the border, I meant specifically to South America. That's the continent, of course. And the MERCOSUR is an acronym / shortened version for Mercado Común del Sur, aka a common market of the South America, a free trade bloc of South America. Now, much like NAFTA, they started talking about this in the mid-1980s, and it was really solidified in the early 1990s. 1991 is when the main players in this, Brazil and Argentina, got together and said, hey, let's eliminate tariffs between our countries and maybe incorporate a couple other countries, and now we have a full-fledged free trade area, a trade bloc. It has expanded since then, not fast, slowly, but it is increasing in influence, and that's why I want to talk a little bit about it right now. Now, what's kind of unique about MERCOSUR? Well, before we get to the unique, what's kind of the same? Much like NAFTA, it is a block of countries that are getting together to promote trade, to eliminate barriers to trade, to lower tariffs, if not get rid of tariffs altogether between the member states. They are working towards free movement of goods and businesses and services and capital that can float around between these member states. However, unlike NAFTA, jot this down, they are also talking about the free movement of labor. And that's really one of the things they started talking about right from the initiation of this thing in the early 90s, is that yes, all the member states agree that people can move around between these countries. That's important because that's what labor is. It's people. And that really complicates the situation because whenever you have physically people crossing international borders being allowed to work wherever they want, migrate wherever they want, you have to standardize a whole bunch of other things too that you don't really think about till you get down to the practical nature of it, which is you kind of have to standardize law across your states. You have to standardize the justice system. You can't have fugitives running around across international borders. You got to have some sort of protection, labor laws that's common amongst all of those countries. So they are working towards that. And this makes MERCOSUR much like the EU, which also has free movement of people. And very much unlike NAFTA, of course, because the US and Canada, they ain't talking about free movement of labor. The hell with that. I mean, the US wants to build a big-ass wall between the US and Mexico. So that makes MERCOSUR kind of unique. Another attribute that makes them slightly unique, to my knowledge, I could be wrong, is that they have kind of set up a standardized tariff system for external trade partners. What does that mean? Well, MERCOSUR is increasingly acting as a single block with a single voice for international trade. So they've lowered tariffs and trade barriers between them, the group of countries in MERCOSUR, but they also have a common policy to trade with, say, China. So when China comes and says, hey, Brazil, we want to sell you some automobiles, the old days, Brazil would say, okay, well, we'll have to set up a relationship and sign some forms, and we're going to put a tariff on your automobiles that come here. And then if China wanted to then sell the same automobiles to Argentina, they'd have to go do the whole thing over again and say, okay, and Argentina would say, well, we have a different tariff that we're going to put. With a single tariff system for the whole block, it does really facilitate and encourage trade because now China goes to the block and says, hey, we want to trade autos, and the block gets together and signs one set of papers, and they set one tariff that applies to all the countries, and that makes trade easier for everybody. Does that make sense? Yeah, that's the MERCOSUR way. Other major points about MERCOSUR. The member states right now are Brazil and Argentina. Again, they were the kind of powerhouse to put this together. And the two countries between them, Uruguay and Paraguay, they were original members as well. And Venezuela, I go ahead and count as a full-fledged MERCOSUR member too, with a little bit of a disclaimer. Pretty much they're in. Pretty much they're a full member. But I think it's Uruguay that has a personal problem with, say, Chavez, and so they've kind of held up the absolute final vote in the Uruguay Congress to accept Venezuela. All the other member states have. It is a foregone conclusion that they will eventually accept Venezuela. I go ahead and say know it now. Venezuela is a full-fledged member. So MERCOSUR has 5 full-on members. Brazil and Argentina being the ones who started it. They're the powerhouse economies, and that's why it's important to note that Venezuela is a part of this now too. Because Brazil's the number 1 economy in South America, Argentina's number 2, Venezuela's number 3. So you have the 3 biggest economies of the continent all now in this single trade bloc. And that's kind of cool. I mean, that builds a critical mass. That's where most of the money is. That's where the action is. And that's what they want to perpetuate, of course, and promote. Pretty much everybody else on the continent is an associate member. Pretty much everybody, not the small little countries of Guyana and Suriname, but all the other countries of South America are associate members. Bolivia, Peru, Ecuador, and even Colombia. And Chile. And I intentionally kind of held off on Chile to the last of this list because associate members all, of course, get some benefits of being in the MERCOSUR club, but not all because they're not full-fledged members. And most of those countries are working towards eventually becoming full members. But not Chile, because Chile was invited to be a full-fledged member of MERCOSUR back in 1991. And they kind of declined. They said, no, we don't want to be a full-fledged member. We'll be an associate member from the start. And they still have that associate member status. Is it because they're not rich enough or don't trade enough or they don't get along well with other MERCOSUR states? No, not at all. Chile actually intentionally said, hey, here's the deal. We actually trade mostly with the United States, which is true. Their biggest trading partner is the U.S. So Chile said, we like the trade bloc and we want to encourage trade with our South American brothers, but we don't want to jeopardize our relationship with the United States. So we're going to remain kind of aloof and stay in this associate member status. And again, they've had that status for going on, 15, 20 years now. And they probably will keep that status. They are kind of tight with the United States, but they're increasingly getting tighter with the Latin American countries as well. So Chile, associate member in a little bit different circumstances. Here's something you definitely need to jot down though. The kind of natural leader of this MERCOSUR movement and MERCOSUR in today's world and South America as a whole is Brazil. Jot it down, jot it down. Brazil sees itself as the natural economic powerhouse and the natural economic leader of Latin America, certainly South America. Brazil sees itself as the United States of South America. So much like the U.S. is kind of the anchor of NAFTA, that's the way Brazil views itself. Now, I point this out in particular because MERCOSUR is increasingly seen as kind of a counter to U.S. influence, a real anti-FTAA. Remember that free trade area of the Americas, which the United States has been encouraging in a very big way. But quite frankly, Brazil has said, we don't really like that. We like the U.S. We love Uncle Sam. We trade a lot with them. But we see ourselves as a leader down here, and we want to be the head cheese of MERCOSUR. We don't want to be yet another subsidiary state of a bigger FTAA in which the United States is the king. Does that make sense? Please remember that. That's kind of really important because Brazil is an up-and-comer that is going to be fulfilling the role as leader of Latin America in the coming years, if not already. And you can even kind of sense this attitude in MERCOSUR with their motto. I mean, the official motto of MERCOSUR is the North of the South. They're saying, we have our own trade bloc down here. We don't need the United States. We're important and we're big boys too, and we have our own bloc that we need to encourage trade amongst ourselves more to get wealthier. We don't need to keep relying on the North. So I kind of like that little motto, the North of the South is MERCOSUR. The other thing which kind of sets MERCOSUR countries apart from a tighter relationship, say in FTAA, is that most of these economies are center-left. There's no other way to put it. They do lean more towards equality of income and wealth within their society. The governments work towards this. Of course, some governments down in Latin America are full-fledged on hardcore lefties like the Venezuelans. But even the ones that aren't hardcore are center-left, focus more on socialist policy, socialist leaning, and that's one of the other reasons they say, you know what, we're kind of different. We're not as hardcore capitalist as the United States and those other NAFTA countries. We are different, and we would like to have our own separate, different little block down here to help encourage each other to grow at our pace, at our rate, in our way, which is, again, a more leftist way than the hardcore capitalist states up north, maybe even in the EU. So this is particularly espoused by, of course, Venezuela. But even Brazil says, yeah, I mean, we have a different focus. We are different. And we, the Brazilians, like to see ourselves as leading this whole movement, which is different. We want to be important in the world, not just a follower of the United States. So it's quite unique. So this MERCOSUR experiment may be the only kind of leftist, socialist, capitalist meld trade bloc on the planet. I mean, certainly you can't call them hardcore leftists all the way because they're in a free trade bloc. That's kind of a capitalist thing. So it's not as if they're forsaking capitalism. They're basing it on free trade, but with more socialist doctrine incorporated into it. So that makes them kind of unique. And Latin America is growing, my friends. It has largely been overlooked and almost dissed by the United States for virtually all of our history. And the United States has gotten used to that role, that Latin America is just the backyard. That's our backyard. We'll deal with that when we have to. It's no big deal. None of the countries down there are that rich. There are no great consequence. We'll get to it when we get to it. But that's changing. Latin America is growing. And economically and politically in the world. Brazil is soon to be a top 10 economy. That's right. Brazil and Argentina are already in the G20. We haven't gotten to that yet, but we will, which means they're in the 20 biggest economies on planet Earth. Brazil it's a comer, man. The rising fortunes are rising fast down in South America as Brazil grows, as all of the economies of this MERCOSUR bloc get a little wealthier, as average salaries have been going up, as economic growth rates have been rising faster than the United States and European ones have, and as foreign trade grows. And I'm thinking especially of China. China. Of course, China has been absorbing more resources, and Latin America, specifically the MERCOSUR bloc, is where China has been going to a lot to establish a lot more trade ties, to buy a lot more goods and services. So MERCOSUR and Brazil and South America as a whole are kind of up and coming in the world, and MERCOSUR hopes to be the bloc that's competing with NAFTA, not being absorbed by an FTA. Make sense? Hope so. That is MERCOSUR.